Okay, well, we've got some more breaking news for you this morning. Very serious story is developing and is coming through to us. And it's that a 3-year-old British girl has gone missing in Portugal. It's thought that she may have been abducted. Her parents discovered she was missing after returning to their hotel room in the Mark Warner Resort at Praia da Luz in the west of the Algarve. Now, the parents had left the girl and at least one other child asleep in their bedroom while they were elsewhere in the hotel.
Is it relevant that the child left alone is 3 years old? Is it relevant that the other 2 children were even younger than 2? So you have 3 children, 3 years and younger, left alone in a hotel in a foreign country.
Watching the hotel room and going back every half hour, and the shutters have been broken open and they've gone into the room and taken Madeleine.
Really? Were the shutters broken? Were the shutters damaged? Was there any evidence of any damage to any of the shutters or even fingerprints on the shutters? Again, echoes of the broken basement window in the Ramsey case.
He said, thank you for your opinion, but that's what we're doing, basically.
There was the conviction that they were guilty. Become growing up inside of us. Why are they escaping? Why don't they stay?
There was the conviction that they were guilty. Okay, but guilty of what?
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. Well, on September 7th, this article appeared in Britain's Guardian newspaper. I'll put a link to it in the description. Kate McCann fears Madeleine killing charge over blood traces in car. Well, you can't get any clearer than that. Can you see it's very clear in September 2007, the blood traces found in the wheel compartment of the rented vehicle were believed to be human. Not only human, but human blood. And how were the authorities alerted to these traces to begin with? How did they know to look there? Well, thanks to the dogs. So were the dogs unreliable after all? Had the dogs alerted to cow blood or fish blood or some other grocery substance? According to the article, detectives suggested to Kate during questioning yesterday that traces of her daughter's blood were found in a car the family first leased 25 days after the 4-year-old had gone missing from their holiday apartment. Well, at the time she was 3 years old. Mrs. McCann told detectives there was no way Madeleine's blood could have been found inside the car and continued to protest her innocence. Ms. McGuinness said, now, you want to pay attention to those words, not so much no way Madeleine's blood could have been found, but no way traces could be found. Make a note of that because we're going to come back to that in a moment. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Bear in mind, I will be traveling to Praia da Luz for the second time, and I'll be reporting to you guys some insights on the ground in Praia da Luz. So if you want to keep up to date with that, please do subscribe. You can also hit the thanks button. By the way, if my voice sounds a bit strange, I do have a bit of a cold, so apologies for that. And let's get started. Now, do you notice how careful the language of the article is nevertheless? The word suggested, it suggested that it was their daughter's blood in the car, right? And that's because it wasn't proved. It wasn't conclusive. And what do you think? Do you think that was legally of some import? Do you think that was legally important?
They have suggested that blood has been found in a hire car.
And in another excerpt, we'll get to that in a moment, the word reportedly is used, reportedly included blood from the McCann's Ocean Club apartment as well. Now, it's interesting how directly the media joined the dots between the dog alerts, which happened in August. This Arguido status thing happened in early September. The dog alerts are actually not even mentioned in this article. And yet the test results from the Forensic Science Service were contingent on those dog alerts. I mean, the test results flowed out of the dog alerts. The dog alerts showed these silly human beings where to test for biological traces, and no one mentions this, where the dogs alerted, guess what? Lo and behold, they found biological traces. Not just blood, but human blood. So how unreliable were the dogs now? The fact that the traces couldn't be 100% linked to Madeleine isn't a dog reliability issue, it's a scientific DNA testing issue. The dogs did their jobs. Going back to the article from The Guardian, the decision to re-interview the couple appeared to be a direct consequence of test results sent from the Forensic Science Service in Birmingham late on Wednesday. Now, when they say appeared to be a direct consequence, do you think that that has turned out to be true in the fullness of time? Was this interpretation correct? Well, also appeared to be a direct consequence of the dog alerts which led to those test results. Portuguese police, who have remained tight-lipped during the investigation, said yesterday they had new evidence to work on. What evidence do you think they're talking about? Well, the dog evidence leading to this biological evidence. Part of the tests have arrived, a source close to the investigation told the Portuguese Lusa news agency. So the tests haven't been completed, but some of them have been completed, and obviously one of the bottom lines of those tests is, yes, it's human biological traces. Is there any association, any confirmation that these DNA traces are related to the McCanns? Evidence analyzed by the Birmingham laboratory reportedly included blood samples and other evidence gathered from the Ocean Club holiday apartment where the McCanns were staying when Madeleine disappeared. So these blood traces came from the apartment, right? Now, although this seemed to be something of a breakthrough in the investigation, certainly at the time, they still don't have Madeleine's body. Even the dogs were never able to find that. But to be fair, even in the Jay Slater case, the dogs couldn't find Jay's body because his body was at the bottom of a cliff. The dogs simply couldn't get there. And where we are here, when all the DNA tests were done, well, they were inconclusive. Back to The Guardian. The Portuguese press speculated yesterday that the scientific evidence strengthened theories that Madeleine may have died in the apartment on the night she disappeared. So it's quite interesting that the Portuguese press are making what one might say logical inferences given what is being concluded, and yet it seems like the British press are struggling to come to similar conclusions. And remember what we said in the previous video, it's not about what you believe, it's about what you can prove. Well, the cops couldn't prove anything without a body, and the McCanns knew it. Their lawyers knew it as well. Back to the article, she said that under Portuguese law, it was very hard to secure conviction relating to the death of a person when the person's body had not been found. Just think about that idea. Very hard to secure conviction without a body, and there hasn't been a body. There hasn't been a conviction. And because it's so difficult, the cops thought their best option was to strike some sort of deal, get Kate to confess, and they'd give her a lenient sentence, less than 2 years, for an offence that carries as much as 10 years in prison. We could give you 2 years if you're lucky. Take the deal.
She did tell me that the Portuguese police had offered to cut her a deal, and if she was lucky, she would only get 2 years.
And then look at this headline from The Sun. Confess and you're out in a year. It's also interesting in this case, like the Ramsey case, a lot of the attention was more on the mother than on the father. His comments followed a claim that Mrs. McCann had been asked by detectives to confess to accidentally killing her daughter. In an interview with ITV News, Madeleine's aunt, Philomena McCann, said they tried to get her to confess to having accidentally killed Madeleine by offering her a deal through her lawyer. If you say you killed Madeleine by accident and then hid her and disposed of the body, then we can guarantee you a 2-year jail sentence or even less. Now, what this seems to be saying is Kate killed Madeleine by accident and then hid her and disposed of her body. Did Kate do all of that? Now, just as we saw after the kidnapping phase with the Ramseys, the moment the McCanns found themselves treated as suspects, they refused to cooperate.
As Kate sat listening to this, she declined to answer every single question. she comforted herself by muttering under her breath, "Bloody tosser."
The narrative afterwards in both cases would be, of course they cooperated all along and answered all questions, etc., etc.
Kate and Jerry are happy to help the police in their investigations.
What's interesting is how, despite Portuguese secrecy laws, the McCann sort of provided a blow-by-blow account of the events through other people, either Jerry's sister, that's Madeleine McCann's aunt, Philomena McCann, or their spokesman, Justine McGuinness, or Jerry's brother, or Jerry himself writing his thoughts in a blog. In this Netflix documentary, this is episode 4, you actually hear one of the other spokesmen saying how upset the police were that this was happening. Well, it didn't seem to bother the people who were doing it. Also worth noting is that the McCanns pitched up to those police interviews in silver vehicles, neither of which were the vehicle. Kate left in a silver Hyundai, while Jerry left in a silver Audi. This is possibly, but not necessarily, because the silver Renault Scenic was still impounded, right? And still being tested, right? Well, what happens when we ask the question, when was this vehicle returned? Well, in August, just 2.5 days after it was initially tested. So they had that car, and they could well have driven to these police interviews in them, and evidently they decided not to. Look at this headline. If the McCann's hire car is vital evidence, why were they still driving in it up until they left? And then there's also this. The McCann silver Renault Scenic was returned to them 2.5 days after being dismantled, stripped and swabbed for forensic analysis at the beginning of August. But if you weren't paying attention, you might not realize the actual car was missing to begin with. Not missing though, just at home, back at the villa, as you can see in the screen grab. Yet we do see them back in the same vehicle, driving in the same vehicle, the silver Renault, when they suddenly skedaddled out of Praia de Luge for the airport 2 days later. And Netflix episode 4 also documents this skedaddling out of Praia de Luge, the media being camped out, the car trying to find its way through, the reporters on motorbikes following them all the way to the airport, journalists even buying tickets onto the plane to sit alongside them on their trip back to Britain. Now, if Portuguese secrecy laws stipulated that you couldn't talk about a case while you were being investigated, it apparently didn't prevent a spokesperson from doing so, or family members, or you doing it in electronic format, such as a blog. And remember, blogs in 2007 were what YouTube is today. Now let's go back to that article in The Guardian. Mr. McCann, who arrived at the police station shortly after 3:40 p.m. today to be questioned by detectives, earlier wrote in his blog, that seems like earlier that same day, he wrote in his blog that it was ludicrous to suggest his wife, who was obviously being interviewed, being questioned at the time that he wrote this blog. So at the time that the police are questioning her, he's writing a blog post and publishing it, which then gets redistributed in the media, right? And I mean, you're supposed to be having Portuguese secrecy law, so you can see there's a concerted effort to put out a counter-narrative. Anyone who knows anything about May 3rd knows that Kate is completely innocent. That's what he wrote in this blog post. And it seems like what he's referring to is the information that came out right in the beginning.
They were just, watching the hotel room and going back every half hour, and the shutters have been broken open and they've gone into the room and taken Madeleine.
How much of that statement, that story that came out as early as May 4th, not only on this channel but on many other British channels, Sky News, etc., the BBC, how much of that was true? That they were actually watching the room. Remember, Madeleine's bedroom was on the other side. According to their story, the window was broken in. That's on the other side of the hotel, not the Tapa 7 side. And was there any evidence of a break-in after the McCann said that there was? Think about that and the Ramsey case. Was there actually any evidence of a break-in?
No words as he walked in, but on his blog today, he has said that anyone who knows about May the 3rd, when Madeleine disappeared, knows that Kate is innocent.
No words, but of course Jerry had just written a blog with many words, and when he walks he certainly does look quite chipper. So you had all three people singing the same tune, essentially, that the charges were ludicrous, that Madeleine was still alive, and we will not stop looking for Madeleine.
Well, they believe they have evidence to show that in some way that she's involved in the death of her daughter, which of course is completely ludicrous.
But it's quite...
In fact, when Jerry was questioned, he was shown as a sort of proof the video of the dogs, and Jerry's response was a sort of shrug of his shoulders, so what response in effect. Jerry was right. The weakest element in the case against them was the failure to produce Madeleine herself, alive or dead. John McCann said at the time, there's no evidence that she's dead, and that's what gives us hope. Well, there's also no evidence that she's alive, or arguably a little evidence that she wasn't alive, this blood evidence.
Her parents, Jerry and Kate McCann, believe she's still alive.
They believe she could still be alive, and they're asking law enforcement officials in Portugal to reopen the case.
But is the dog evidence really no evidence? Are the blood traces no evidence? So the charges were ludicrous. This meant that Madeleine was still alive, and we will not stop looking for Madeleine. Here is John McCann repeating the same mantra.
Because anybody who knows Jerry and Kate knows that to implicate them in any way is ridiculous.
So the charges were ridiculous, ludicrous. This meant that Madeleine was still alive, and we will not stop looking for Madeleine. And of course, 2 days later, the McCanns did stop looking for Madeleine. They caught a flight home because they unexpectedly bolted out of Praia da Luz. Kate McCann had said, at this moment in time, I cannot think about going home without Madeleine. Well, that is exactly what she did. Now, a good analogy for what happened here, if we look at the Ramsey case, would be if evidence of JonBenet was found in the wine cellar, but not JonBenet, just traces of JonBenet, and not enough to say it was definitely JonBenet, just kind of like biological traces. And then the Ramseys finally were subjected to questions in April 1997, except they didn't answer them. Not only that, swore under their breath while they were being questioned and wrote blog posts at the same time about their innocence, meanwhile insisting that JonBenet was still out there somewhere. Does that make sense? But I think the real question is, how is it this episode was forgotten? I mean, how is Madeleine not alive? Like this article says so. The Portuguese press speculated yesterday that the scientific evidence strengthened theories that Madeleine may have died in the apartment on the night she disappeared. And then a few months later, she was alive, and the British government went on to spend over £13.2 million on the search for Madeleine, and they're apparently still searching. Ironically, when we cut to the present, the German police are trying to keep the case alive in order to bag their man. Although, unhelpfully for the McCanns, the German police keep saying they have evidence Madeleine is dead. It also has to be said the German investigation into Madeleine McCann right now seems to be running out of steam. Would you agree with that? What is ludicrous is really the tone-deaf, inconsistent, fragmented coverage from the media. Just have a look at these headlines. From just one publication on the question, just on this question of whether Madeleine is alive or not. Look at this. Between 2020 and 2022, Madeleine goes from being dead to there being a slim hope that she's alive. Madeleine McCann must be the only human being in human history that the longer she's missing, the more hope there is that she's alive. I've covered several missing persons cases as well as the 1996 Everest disaster. It usually takes ordinary people a lot less time to accept someone has died when they disappear without a trace. Also, if you Google whether Madeleine is alive or dead, the AI can't actually commit to an answer. It simply says her whereabouts remain unknown. What I think this shows is that there are real limits to AI and that human intelligence and intuition still has a place in true crime. Would you agree with that? In any event, the McCanns suddenly left Praia da Luz on September 9th, shortly after saying they wouldn't leave until they found Madeleine. Curiously, they didn't return the rental car on the day that they left. Most people would. You would, wouldn't you? Instead, it was returned almost 2 weeks later by friends of the McCanns who remained behind. I think it was returned on September 20th. After carefully curating their image in the media, they're fleeing Portugal under a cloud of suspicion, arguably a lot worse than the one that ever hung over the Ramseys. Well, it wasn't a good look, and things were about to get worse. A witness who'd been completely forgotten about and who said he saw a man carrying a blonde child late at night towards the beach. By the way, there were other people besides this man who saw the same thing. Well, he said he thought there was something familiar in what he saw when a man, now in Arguido, got off the flight from Portugal while carrying a child. Incredibly, the British media didn't seem to pay any attention to this either. There definitely was no discussion or confrontation of this aspect in 2007 or for the next several years, until 2013, when the Tanner sighting was finally debunked. In the weeks following their return, the McCanns wasted no time in redirecting their PR campaign to prove their innocence, starting with the hiring of a huge big gun, Clarence Mitchell. Over the next few months, Kate would agree to taking a polygraph, have her hair tested for sedatives, and campaign for the release of the police files so they could clear their names. It looked good and sounded sincere. And have a look at these headlines. McCann's offer to take lie detector tests, September 2007. You can also see at the bottom of this article from September 2007, just 2 weeks after they were made suspects, the McCanns offered an interesting explanation for the DNA traces found in the wheel compartment of the Renault Scenic. Look at this. It emerged this week that partial DNA traces found in the Renault Scenic hired by the family almost a month after her disappearance could potentially be explained by contact with Madeleine's clothes, which were transported in it when they moved to a rented villa. So they seem to be saying, you know what, Madeleine wasn't in this vehicle, but her clothes were. It seems to be an acknowledgement of sorts that those traces were Madeleine after all, which is quite a different response to what was said about how ludicrous it could be that traces of Madeleine could ever be found in the vehicle. And Justine McGuinness would emphasize, well, the vehicle was hired 25 days after the fact. And so all of this is very ludicrous when it came to light on September 7th.
So much on the parents.
Well, I think originally the situation was the parents were not as truthful as they should have been in the beginning stages of the case. And at that point in time, the police got very suspicious and started pursuing that avenue of investigation. And they just...
What do you think he's referring to? What were they not truthful about? And of course, after pledging to take a polygraph in September, did they ever take one? And although the toxicology test for sedatives was important and implied that no sedatives were used, I think Kate McCann was also tested for antidepressants. Would sedatives or antidepressants still be in hair 8 months later? For these tests to have had real efficacy, they ought to have been conducted in early May, not September. Any decent doctor would tell you that. It's interesting how the sedative test was regarded as definitive proof of an absence of evidence, while the DNA test, which didn't show nothing, just not enough of something, was regarded as definite proof of absence as well. And then, less than a year later, having brought no charges against anyone for the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, the Portuguese police shelved the investigation, and that then led to the release of the case files. When the police files were released, it was in a different language, and the McCanns basically had first dibs at this information. Much as we saw in the Amanda Knox case, what was then released to the press and then to the public was all the evidence favorable to the McCanns. It took a while for the public to get access to these documents and even longer to translate, interpret, and make sense of everything. What only emerged much later was that some British investigators developed evidence following a line of inquiry looking into the possibility that the parents could have been involved. Look at this from the Times. A source at the FSS in Birmingham, which carried out the test on behalf of the Portuguese authorities, is reported to have said that the results showed police were right to make the couple arguidos, or official suspects. Is that something you ever see in the British media these days? And look at this from The Guardian, dated December 2010. WikiLeaks cables. UK police developed evidence against Madeleine's parents. Remember, the McCanns had the benefit of a PR blitz that went on for 3 months prior to the accusations finally being announced. They had celebrities. They had so much of the media on their side. They had big amounts, donations going on. Their website getting the most hits of any website in the world. And then you have the accusations finally being announced on September 7th in quite muted form against them.
McCann was today made a formal suspect in the disappearance of her daughter Madeline. Friends of the McCanns confirmed that she is an arguida after police called her in again for questioning today.
It is harder for the police to comment here because of the secrecy laws.
So the McCanns had always developed momentum with the media in terms of their narrative. They had the advantage of kind of the first mover advantage in terms of getting their narrative out there long before the official investigative narrative got out there. And they had also developed relationships with the hosts of the media. So it was only a matter of time for that momentum to overwhelm the investigation, especially after it closed with no charges. Just as we saw in the Ramsey case, the fact that no charges were brought, or no charges seemed to be brought, seemed to suggest that there was no evidence against the McCanns, a fact that Jerry and Kate were keen to emphasize at every opportunity, along with their belief that Madeline was still alive. To many, especially the faithful, this was taken as a sign of faith, of something good, as something to be hopeful about, rather than deception or simply trying to protect their own self-interest. And what about the British media? Well, the British media seemed to assume from this, firstly, that there was no evidence after all. I mean, that's what the McCanns kept repeating. Not insufficient evidence, no evidence, kind of like the Boulder DA. And Madeline has been alive, and the McCanns have been innocent in the eyes of the British media ever since.
To be able to fund
regardless,
the investigation.
they're out there pleading and saying that they believe strongly that their daughter is still alive. You have said that you believe she's not. Why?
What do you think? Is Madeline dead or alive? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for listening. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you guys next time.